My name is Mike Gold. I'm the Vice President for Washington Operations and Business Development at Space Systems Loral, the world's most prolific commercial satellite manufacturer. I also chair the ComStat, Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, which is the Federal Advisory Committee of the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, where I used to chair the Export Controls Working Group. That's where all of my gray hair came from, and now chair the full committee. So engineers hate it when I say this, but the technical and the engineering, that's the easy part of a space mission. Like, that's all doable. It's the legal, the regulatory, the political, the financial. This is where I think our industry truly runs into trouble. As I said in the commercial space panel, second only to gravity, the ITAR had the greatest chance of preventing a rocket from actually launching. So we have assembled an all-star panel of legal and regulatory experts to take you through these issues. And we're going to begin with Nasser al-Rashidi, who, let me tell you, when I get depressed about space law and policy in America, and that's pretty much 24/7, I refurbish myself by giving this guy a call. And he is the architect of a space law and policy in the UAE that I am so jealous of, it brings me to tears. Common sense. I mean, we need to emulate this in the US. So folks, let's have a warm round of applause, not only to welcome Nasser, but for a job well done in writing my favorite space policy. Nasser al-Rashidi, everyone.
Thank you, Mike. And first, it's very difficult to talk after you. In addition, I always like hearing you. Not of course, for this last part, but seriously, there's a lot of wisdom. In every conference we have in the UAE, we always make sure that Mike is in the top of the list. Now, this time I had a problem with my people because they made him a moderator. And I was like, I want to hear him talk, so please make him a panelist. Like, no. You know, he should be moderating this session, and this time you talk, Nasser. So thank you very much for this nice introduction. And I'm really excited about the topic that we're talking about, of course, the regulator. And I just totally echo what you mentioned, and I think the distinguished speakers and panelists in here, they might share the same view. That most of the time people think of the space part and the science and the technology, it's very well much evolving. But believe it or not, you find that sometimes the challenge in the legal aspects, the policy aspects, and the political aspects, which also later on, of course, impact the economic and the finance or vice versa, is the real challenge. So I think that the topic we're talking about is, of course, how you ensure that your regulatory framework is an attractive one, a responsive one. Well, of course, you find out later if it's actually the case. That's your ultimate goal. But in my view, there are four things that when we develop the national regulatory framework, it's still actually under development. We finished with the policy. We have a draft law, draft regulations, draft strategy. Everything is in a draft because we're taking it slowly in terms of developing them. So the policy is out. It's issued back in September 2016. And I'll say something about maybe the pursuing of making sure that this regulatory framework is attractive. Number one is your approach of what I call policy or regulatory framework management. So if you think of it of just, it's only about making sure that, whatever it says is attractive, that will get me there. No, it's the whole process. From the day you start drafting that all the way to the way you actually review that draft, in every step or in every phase of that life cycle, it impacts the attractiveness and the responsiveness of this. Let me say this. It's from the beginning, when you are drafting your regulatory framework, not clear what is it that you would like to get in the end of the day after you finish that draft, it will never be attractive, or there is a big chance it will not be attractive. At the time, now you know what you want. If you did not define your stakeholders who will be impacted clearly, you know who are the national, regional, and international, the different types, the scientific, the commercial, the government, the military, the non-military, are not taken into consideration, there is a big chance it will not be attractive. If you don't engage them at the right time, and even the way you approach them, I don't give them the full policy, I give them the part that makes sense to them, because this is where they can give me most. I would like to get 90% of his energy of what really matters to him, rather than scatter that 90% or 100% of his energy in things that he doesn't really care about, and he will not add much of a value. So that's in the drafting mode. And now you come to the development mode. So you have the draft ready. If you don't give good awareness about that draft, approach your different stakeholders, talk to them, and talk to them to what matters to them, and the document is just issued and it's in the shelf, then you didn't do anything. Now it's there, you sit with them, you're rolling it out. If you don't have a good governance, you establish a body that monitors what have we achieved, what makes sense, what does not make sense, how can we improve, then it will also, because technology is evolving, science is evolving, services are evolving. So it's the whole life cycle of that policy document management that could ensure that it's attractive. Because if it's attractive today, it might not be attractive tomorrow. It's not there forever. So to ensure that it is always attractive, it's the whole life cycle. That's the first point. The second point is that as we're moving today towards commercialization of space, and we're engaging more of private sector and innovators, standardization. We need to start talking from, leave from principles to an actual standardizations. We lived for so long with treaties that talks about principles and high-level things, which is great. But we need to start mapping standards towards these objectives. Third one is there is not one size that fits all. So most of the time people were, and sometimes in the regulatory framework, they wanted to deal the same way with all the different audience. So I will deal with the academies the same way I'm dealing with the commercials, the same way I will deal with the government. They're not the same. Even their activities is not the same. The small satellite is not as the big. So you need to address different regulations to the different audience. Last one that I think I believe it could bring an attractive regulatory framework is coordination, coordination, coordination. And the first coordination here refers to intra-sector coordination. So among the space people, so the space agency with the space operators, space science and R&D that are working on space. So the space community, that's the intra-sector one. That's the first coordination. The second coordination is intra-sector, so space with other sector, whether it's aviation, telecommunications, and other sectors that are related to the space, and they're working closely, or I would call them sometimes the adjacent sectors. And the third coordination is international coordination, because in the end, you need to have harmony, interoperability, which makes hopefully this attractive to the industry, avoiding double standards, avoiding dual licensing, and so on. Those, I think, were the 4 points that hopefully will make regulatory frameworks attractive.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
I am nodding so hard my head is going to fall off. Again, as a practitioner, you have no idea how refreshing it is to hear all that. When I testify before Congress, and over the summer I did in both the Senate and the House, what NASA sets up is great, because I go to Capitol Hill and I say, look at what the UAE did. Why can't we do that? So again, it's a great target for us to try and get to. Moving down to the left, we have Professor Dr. Mahulena Hofmann. She's the holder of the SES Chair in Space, Satcom, and Media Law at the University of Luxembourg. She organizes annual international workshops related to the new problems of space and telecommunication law, and has published several books collecting, analyzing the contributions presented at these workshops. Since 2016, Mrs. Hofmann serves as a co-director of the master's program in space communication and media law offered by the Faculty of Law, Economics, and Finances in Luxembourg. In 2016, she was the head of the international team, which analyzed the international framework of space mining activities envisioned by Luxembourg. So when you get to the asteroid and it's already all mined out, we have Professor Hofmann to blame. So let's have a warm round of applause for Professor Hofmann.
Let me say one thing before she starts, just an inspiring thing. She has worked in the analytics of one of the most inspiring legislation for space lawyers. That is the one that Luxembourg, I think it's issued now, or it's still under final stages, but every space lawyer should have already an idea about utilization of space resources. So I'm very inspired by her analytics and work, and it's really inspiring even to our draft regulations here in the UAE. So thank you.
Thank you for these very kind words and for the very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, first let me thank you for the opportunity to be in this fascinating conference and in this fascinating country. As has been already said, I come from the University of Luxembourg, and I could only stress what Nasir just said, that in preparing a legislation, the key issue is the discussion with those who should use it at the latest. So, of course, it is necessary to involve all the operators or all the addressees of the legislation to listen to their needs, to their criticism, in order to prepare a draft which could serve as an effective instrument later. At the same time, it is crucial to offer an education for those who should apply the legislation in the future. That's why the University of Luxembourg, after 3 years of experiments, has launched a master program in space, communication, and media law, which is a full-fledged master program open internationally to everyone who would be interested to study this education. This program is drafted with close cooperation with the SES, the operator which has the seat just 20 kilometers distance from the university. So the students used to have their seminars in the seat of the SES. They can touch the antennas almost, and they can closely with the practice develop their abilities. Another part of the work of the chair is, of course, the research. As had been already said, we are organizing annual international workshops dealing with ownership of satellites, dealing with the regulatory framework of satellite communication, dealing with harmful interference, because the telecommunication issue is one part of our work which we are devoting particular attention to. And we are publishing books from every of these conferences. In these weeks, the book on ownership of satellites is going to appear. Last but not least, it has been already said that the chair had an opportunity to be involved in the preparatory works for 2 pieces of legislation in Luxembourg. The first one is a specific legislation dealing with space resources, and the second one is general space law. The issue is that all space or activities in Luxembourg have been authorized on the basis on the old law on electronic media. But the richness of the activities of Luxembourg does not correspond to this rather simple legislation, so it has been necessary to create new law which gives transparent legal framework for the operators, letting them know how to apply for the license, how long does it take, where they can apply for a remedy, how much does it cost, and so on, to open the framework for all who wish to operate under the jurisdiction of Luxembourg. I would perhaps stop here to let the opportunity to your questions, and I would pass the word to my next colleague. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Some fascinating things going on in Luxembourg right now. Sticking with the European theme, let's move on to Marco Ferrazzani. Am I getting that right, Marco? Okay, good. He is the head of Legal Services Department, Legal Counsel of the European Space Agency, so basically chief lawyer for ESA, where he is in Paris, France. And in this position, he provides a full spectrum of legal advice and guidance on the legal and programmatic aspects of ESA programs and policies. As ESA's legal counsel, Dr. Marco is advisor to the ESA Director General and to the ESA Council for all institutional and legal matters, including interpretation of the ESA Convention and all relevant legal instruments. As the head of ESA's legal department, he provides advice to ESA's organs and member states on all legal matters, including defending the rights of ESA, preparing draft agreements, and conducting international negotiations, identifying the legal liabilities and devising legal solutions to mitigate them, and preparing ESA institutional decisions, resolutions, declarations, and other legal instruments for the execution of European space programs. I mean, I only play an attorney on television these days, so let's have a round of applause for a real lawyer there. Dr. Marco.
Thank you, Michael. All this sounds very attractive, interesting, but I would just start with a note. ESA is the space agency of the European states. We also work a lot for the European Union. As you know, we do the space program management for the European Union. So we have a lot of interesting programs. But when I talk to my colleagues, engineers, program people, program managers, political deciders, I always tell them the law in all this is here to help you take decisions, to enable things to be done and not to prevent you. So our way of building up our approach to law is really to use law as an enabler of decision makers, as an enabler of institutions to be created, like space agencies, programs, financing, private investment. And in doing that, I have to say, the space sector altogether, in terms of regulation, is pretty in good shape, in my point of view. It is fairly less regulated if you compare it to other sectors of the world, like aviation, transport, maritime, even telecommunications. Space has fewer regulations in the end. We might discuss whether they're good or what should we do, but we have to say we have few regulations, internationally speaking, states are supervising, and then there's a whole range of practice and activities. And I would say the future of space law and regulation is not really in creating new conventional space law internationally, but more in putting into practice, into right interpretation, put into practice practical measures. So not hard law, normative with authority and sanctions, but more what I call soft lawmaking in terms of approaching pragmatic solutions with a bottom-up approach, finding behaviors and solutions or practices or procedure which don't really bear a sanction by itself, but they reward those who do it properly. They are recognize that if you do it well, you participate in a club, and you're recognized, and you're reliable. So it's a matter of reputation in the end. And I find it these days much more effective, that kind of approach, especially among space agencies in the world, among international programs, because you gain access to become a partner or being part of a club. And I can give you several examples. On Earth observation, for many years, different states in the world would do their own programs, but only after an international body called CEOS established standards for reading data, that the data were exchanged, thanks to CEOS standards. And CEOS standards is not a regulation, it's just a soft law approach how to determine technical standards common to all. And we have several examples: space debris, frequency coordination, UN COPOS. There's a lot of examples today in the last years where bottom-up is more effective and most close to the problem than international treaty-making legislation. And that's the kind of approach we suggest. And we find it easy to do, more effective, less formal, of course, less mandatory, more voluntary, but also close to the reality.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Moving down the line, we have Dr. Olga Stelmakh. She is a postdoctoral fellow in space governance at McGill Institute of Air and Space Law, where she coordinates the international study on global space governance and conducts research on space sustainability and security. She also serves as a global partnership manager for the World Space Week Association. Prior to that, she was with George Washington University's Space Policy Institute, a couple blocks away from me in DC, so good to see a homer there. Prior to that, she was also with the Parliament of Ukraine, the German Aerospace Center, the Ukrainian Space Agency, and the European Space Agency. She holds 2 LLM degrees, 2 master degrees in business, and a doctorate in international law. That's more degrees than we have in Washington, D.C. right now, where it's cold. Let's have a warm round of applause for her. Dr. Olga.
Thank you for such an introduction. Right now I don't know how to start, so that's okay. So when I say that I'm coming from McGill, two words are said. You have a very long and cold winter, and you deal with global space governance. So yes, McGill Institute of Foreign Space Law is very famous for taking the lead over the implementation of the global space governance study. How did it start? It started like in 2014 at the second Manfred Lachs conference that brought together more than 100 experts from different fields from around the world, representing different regions, different law traditions, and not just law traditions, but also different backgrounds. And there was a Montreal Declaration adopted that, among other things, empowered McGill University to take the lead over conducting this study and also disseminating it and presenting it to a larger audience afterwards. So our project involved many experts, dozens of experts, close to 100 experts. It was a very long project, and taking this occasion, I would like just to say that in May, on the 5th and 6th May, this year in Montreal, we will have a final conference at which the findings of the study will be introduced to people who are interested. Like, everybody is welcome to come and join us. There will be a book published as outcome of the study. For example, Scott Madry, who is present here, he is also one of our very distinguished experts, and many more. This is what I'm currently doing. I'm coordinating this study. It's really in the final stage. Big team is behind. Many efforts has been put towards very successful implementation. So it really represents different aspects of global space governance. But what in addition, what is my vision? What do we need right now when talking about space law? Describing what did happen over the last 50 years, I would say two words can describe. It's paradigm change. From what we started to where we are now, it's really a very big difference. And we cannot say that we have to refurbish the existing legal framework. We have to really reconsider what we have in stock. For this, because legal regulation is very fragmented, it's extremely important to have a holistic picture. For this, global space governance is extremely important because it permits to analyze what do we have, what is the status right now, where is the gaps, where is the room for improvement. In my own research, I focus on the need to talk about the good global space governance, because global space governance is good when it's good for it's inclusive, it takes into consideration interests of all space actors, not just limiting to governments. We really need to hear the voice of the private industry, of the private sector, because today it's primarily, not primarily, but it's commercial space has a very significant part in the general space economy. And the question that arises very often is, do we want to govern or do we want to be governed? Do we want to be engaged in the legal developments? Do we want to put more initiatives, or we will just follow what will be developed by others? Do we need really like legal certainty, or we will be satisfied with kind of gaps and legal uncertainty? So what is more beneficial for us? And but practice maybe shows that new space commerce, they do prefer to have legal certainty. I have been approached by some people representing some countries that are not spacefaring countries, and not even emerging space countries, but they are willing to become space countries. So they're asking, how can we start? How we will proceed? What about space law? What about space policy? So what do you recommend us? Unfortunately, as of today, there are no real recommendations, but the part of space world that is not present right now here, they're right now in Vienna at the COPUS, Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. And yesterday, the day before, there was a handbook of new space actors, presented by Secure World Foundation representatives. It's a really, I did not see it yet, but it's, from what I heard, it's a very promising handbook that will be really very helpful for the new space commerce, because it gives recommendation on how to proceed, where to start, where to end, what is currently in place. So I do believe that this kind of, not even like standards, but guidelines of what should be done is extremely helpful. Law can follow two ways. Either it follows the developments or so it's either follows or anticipates. If you do consider what is happening right now in the space field, law follows the developments. I can give you some example. A regulation of large constellation of small satellites. For the time being, there is nothing specific applicable to this category of satellites. Drones, asteroid mining, new modes of space transportation. The list can be longer than that, but we see very well that there is a need in legal regulation. So there is need in legal certainty to make it more reliable, predictable. As a motto of International Symposium on the Private and Commercial Space Flight says, we will not stop. And I believe it's important for us not to stop, to look forward, not trying to completely change the system, because the system, global space governance system, is quite mature right now. We should really see where there's a room for improvement, what can be done, what should be done, and I really want to second Marco, what he told. Two very important points. First, because we have this space sectors are very different right now from what we had before the beginning of space age. So bottom-up approach is really the best one what we can have. It's extremely difficult to build consensus when having in a room representatives from different governments. And in most of the cases, unfortunately, the voice of the private sector is not heard. So what should be done is really to involve private sector, to really acknowledge that bottom-up approach is the best one for the current state of development. And second point is we really need kind of social responsibility, standards for behavior. Belonging to the Space Club, it's really a privilege. It's not a right, it's a privilege. And belonging to the Space Club, we have to create a specific image. We have to really adhere to certain level of behavior, certain standards. And this should be done. I think this is where we can focus our attention in the short term and long run. It's extremely important. Unfortunately, law doesn't cover new space business fields, and even taking into consideration that when talking about new modes of space transportation, reusability, et cetera, we again acknowledge that there is this mixture of aviation and space. We tried to make this delimitation. We were telling that aviation is very different from space activities, but we see there is some more and more like merging synergy. So I think there will be a big work for the lawyers to be done in order to facilitate and ease new space business. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Olga. Now, to be a truly sophisticated panel, you have to have at least 2 Italians on it. So now we'll move to our second one, Luca Rossettini. Luca is a serial entrepreneur seeking profitable and sustainable expansion of the humankind in space. In 1998, Luca quit his airborne officer career and got a master's in aerospace engineering in Italy. After a year working in U.S. research lab on nanotechnologies applied to space propellant, he came back to Europe, where in 2005, he successfully concluded a master's in strategic leadership towards sustainability. During his PhD studies in advanced space propulsion, concluded in 2008 with honors, Luca founded IRTA, a startup that provided advanced vision and slow-motion tracking techniques. In 2006, he co-founded the Natural Step Italia. The Natural Step is an international NGO that helps corporations and communities to pursue their objectives within a strategic sustainability framework. Everyone's have a warm round of applause for Luca.
Thank you very much and kind words. And when I started my company, the current company is the Orbit, I had a dream at that time that was to travel, to create a travel transportation company in space. It was 2010, and a colleague of mine, I was working at NASA Ames at the time in California, told me, yeah, you know, the space is big, so there's a space for everyone. And then I start thinking, well, space debris, the space is big. Yes, the space is big, but we are not using the whole space. We are using specific areas, and they are getting crowded. I said, okay, if no one is really creating and selling a solution, probably there is a big market opportunity. So instead of starting a company with no market, that is space transportation today, I decided to start providing solutions to the space sector on space debris mitigations. We start building an autonomous system that could be installed on satellite and able to remove the satellites even if the satellites die in orbit. So you really can remove the junk from orbit, you know, according not only to regulations that we have today, but also for the future regulations. We start addressing also the new space market, that it's a growing and coming sector. They are creating a lot of good services for our society, but a lot of new and known problems for the space sector. So we provide CubeSat with a system that can increase the lifetime of their CubeSats and still be able to remove them at the end of life. And eventually, a 100 kilogram platform that actually can position small satellites or payload precisely in orbit. It's basically providing the same service that today only the big players, the big satellite operators can have from launchers, in order to decrease the chance of losing these small satellites all around in a very dense and populated area. So basically, what we do is to find a way to provide the benefit, to like commercial benefit to a customers in such a way that they are not forced, they don't perceive this solution to space debris as a cost, but they can see an advantage of applying them. And doing that, we realize that, of course, we can, at the beginning, you can try to avoid battles against lawyers or against, you know, like politics and against regulations, but eventually you have to help regulations, politics, and to show that there is a way, there is a technology that can accelerate the regulation cycle. As a young company, we cannot live and sustain ourselves against a regulation cycle, but if we work together, then there is a chance of speeding up the process. So this is it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. You mentioned space debris. So space is big. It's also full of debris. And the question we struggle with from a regulatory perspective is, what do we do as individual countries? What do we do as a globe to deal with this issue? So I'm just wondering the panel's thoughts on this. Nasser, since you're unfortunately right on my left, could I start with you, and then we'll go down the row?
Yeah. Okay. So, of course, to deal with debris, you need multiple of things. Of course, you need, of course, the systems, the technologies behind things, which is sometimes does not exist with, you know, every country. So you need to, of course, to have an international collaboration that comes with it. But then, of course, you need to have the, I would say, it's more of the standardization part. So I try not to put it directly with the regulation, maybe at a low or regulatory level. You mentioned high level. That's at least the UAE approach. We talk about it as a principle. The operator, as part of the draft law and the draft regulations on the authorization, we talk about it that the regulator needs to take into account the guidelines that are issued by the agency in this regard, and we leave the details to that guidelines. When you come to the guidelines, you look at the best practices, and of course, you might find case by case. There are some systems that are, you know, going, you know, exactly far in space. There are ones who are in the, you know, LEO. There are others which are in the GEO. Each one, you deal with it differently. You put the principles clear in the guidelines, and you leave the standards to the industry, and you ask them to show me what's best practice you're applying against the guidelines that you put. So this is the approach we took. We put the principles in the law that you need to follow this. In the regulatory, we put guidelines, and then later on we push it to a best practice coming from the industry to make sure that we're not putting an extra or unnecessary burden on the operator.
Makes a lot of sense. You know what we've done in the US about the issue?
Nope.
Nothing. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you. So in Luxembourg, as a seat of the SES, one of the biggest world operators, the question of space debris is, of course, of utmost importance. And that's why the provision which prohibits to create extra debris and which obliges all participants of space activities to take care that they don't produce exaggerated amount of the debris is part of the project of the national legislation. So as this, it will be binding for those who are operating from Luxembourg.
Space debris is a big issue more and more today because there are thousands of pieces now that were not planned, and they're not regulated. There's no piece of international law that provides what to do and how to do. However, there's a principle of responsibility. We know that in case of re-entry. But what do we do for operations? ESA, in its history, had more than 80 spacecraft in orbit at different times. We have many operating now. And the day when the guidelines came to being was because, as I said, it was an approach among practice of space agencies doing the work. So bottom up, ESA and other space agency in the group called EADC defined what are minimal technical standards of common interest without wanting to create a regulation, a treaty, or imposing norms, but just seeing the common interest of those who use space and want to continue to be used space freely. So as soon as the guidelines were adopted at the ADC and then at the UN COPOS, we took them seriously. So even without the need to be them international law, we put them into our internal legal order of a space agency with the Initiative Act that I drafted. It was approved internally, and now they are mandatory for us, for our own self-imposed criteria. So all our projects are following them. We're complying with them, including how to build a spacecraft, how long it should stay, avoid defragmentation, re-entry into 25 years, a lot of criteria. You can read them. Huh? You can read the ESA space debris mitigation. It's public. And all our projects comply to them, which means also the project we run for and we build for the European Union, Copernicus, for EUMETSAT, for anybody who uses ESA, we follow the standards. So this is another example how self-regulation, if you want soft law, can become much more effective in having a piece of international law that has to be monitored, enforced, and controlled in that way. So, of course, space debris will not disappear in one go. It will take a long time. But it's important that from now on, space agencies and operators start following the guidelines so that in the medium and long term, we'll have a better and safer use of outer space.
Wonderful. Thank you. Olga?
Yes. Just talking about space debris, everybody acknowledges that space debris is a really critical issue and one of the biggest challenges for space activities. But still, guidelines have become enforceable, or not enforceable, like mandatory somehow, if they are implemented on the national level. However, what we can see is that different states, they approach this in a different way. And this can really boost following the flag of convenience, moving from one jurisdiction to another one, where there are no real obligations imposed on space sectors with regard to end-of-life disposal plan and so on and so forth. So some states are extremely strict with regard to space debris issue, and they really not just implement those principles enshrined in the guidelines, but they're going further, elaborating them, going into more detail, creating additional standards, etc., etc. So, some are really like more relaxed with regard to these requirements. However, if we really talk about long-term sustainability of outer space activities, if we really want to, as Marco already said, kind of seconding his ideas, we really have to think about how, because efforts undertaken by just one state are not sufficient. This should be a really cooperative action. Well, everybody have to acknowledge that being responsible space sector is extremely important, because on your behavior depends possibility to freely access to space, not just from current generation but also future generation. So it should be really, it is currently a mutual concern. It should be really a mutual joint effort.
Last but not least, Luca.
Well, you know, my angle is more commercial, so for me today the space debris is an opportunity more than a threat. However, if we think about the cost of space debris and who generated the space debris and who's paying for this cost, but even more, the cost that is going to be generated with the new space and commercial activities out of space debris, and who's going to pay for that. And at the moment, taxpayers are paying for this cost. So what I'm expecting is that in the future, commercial company will be charged for their waste left in space. I think it's quite normal. We do it here, right? I pay my waste tax in Italy. I think all of you will pay something. And the other aspect is today we have regulations, guidelines, and so on that, let's say, motivate satellite operators to demonstrate that they are able to remove the satellite at the end of life. But if your satellite dies while it is in orbit, that's it. That translator in our life means you are driving in a highway, and of course you don't want that your car stop working, right? So you do whatever you can to make it work as long as possible. But your car suddenly dies, and you just open the door, you are in the third lane of the highway, and leave the car there, and then buy a new car. And the other guy behind you arrive, and even his car, stopped working. So he left the car and then walk away. And this is actually what is happening in space right now. So I think there are some aspects. So we are doing a lot of progress, but we are not there yet. And I believe the commercial sector has the responsibility of showing that it's possible, that there are solutions that could be applied to make it possible. And we need to cooperate in this sense.
Nasser.
Sorry. Thank you very much. So I just want to echo what Luca is talking, and this is the approach that we thought of here in the UAE. That, as I mentioned, we look at things at different categories. So at the law, you put the principle that although legally speaking, it might not be necessary to refer to space debris, because you can have a general statement that says, you want to make sure that, assess against any risks and so on, but we put it in there looking at other examples also from the world, just to highlight the importance of it. And you talk about it from a principle level. You come to the guidelines or to the regulations, and again, you start now talking a little bit more about it in details, but again, we don't get into the level of standardization at this stage from a national perspective. Now, this is not an internal perspective. What the operator eventually, when he's going through the authorization process, he has to show what he has done against these principles or guidelines. And one of the reasons that we don't draft the standards ourselves, because there are several types of spacecrafts and type of operation, different missions. And there is always evolvement. And the best one to do these standards is actually the industry themselves, and they always keep improving and so on. Second thing that we looked at is that to make sure that we're not asking for extra burdens. If the industry come with something and is meeting the principle, that makes us feel comfortable that this is balancing between the safety requirements and security requirements, but also the economic sense. And last is the liability that comes. So if I say as a national, this is the standard you need to do, and he says, fine, this is what I'm going to apply because you asked me for it, I'm also taking liability into in my consideration. So that was something that we're also thinking about. So with this, I think the different levels probably was something that we think about, and we leave the standard to the most appropriate best practice, and he needs to show me how it's really responding to each of these principles. And if it makes sense, the experts in that case says that makes sense, you're meeting the qualification, you get the authorization, and so on.
Yeah, it's a great point. I would just note, wearing my Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee hat, we have a standards working group. And it is industry who sets those standards, because government doesn't understand what we're doing. Many of these space projects are unique. So who better than industry to at least take the first draft of that? So it's a wonderful idea. So now is the time when we turn it over to the audience to ask questions. Not only do you get an exclusive opportunity to talk to these great legal minds, but to ensure that we get questions, anyone who asks a question will get either a Loral geosatellite field of view or a NASA satellite servicing sticker. So, there we go. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Is that you here?
It works.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
I think he started first. This guy, yes. Okay, that's the first question. What's your second question?
Yeah.
That was the easy one.
I will be maybe a little provocative here, but let's say when you are considering one nation to issue a law, it takes you, let's say, best case months, if you are under pressure, or years if there is no real pressure. If you are talking about a group of nations or the world,
Treaty.
because here we want to involve the whole community, we are talking about tens of years before arriving to something to have a common things. And I would say that in global forum, the future of mankind is not really the goal that everybody is looking for. So,
Well, you clearly haven't been to Copuus then.
no, but what I want to say here is, right now, the commercial space is popping up, and a lot of activities are coming out, and space exploration, space exploitation of resources is one of them, that are really out of, right now, any existing law, any existing international treaties. The time that the international community could reach an agreement on any kind of legal framework for this activity, first of all, this activity has happened most of the time, or something else will come. And so, is it really relevant to pursue international regulation on that kind of things?
Thank you for this wonderful question. Let me confine on two remarks. In principle, even if there is an urgency to make an action in pursuing a space activity, two fields have to be respected. One, it is the ITU law. So first, the operator has to get a frequency band for its operation to be able to act harm-free in outer space. Two, the Outer Space Treaty has to be observed because it has been ratified by more than 100 countries. It brings relatively general but clear rules, and it represents also a customary international law. Other legislations perhaps can be set aside, but these two packages of regulations are obligatory and have to be respected. Thank you.
We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Outer Space Treaty. Happy birthday, Outer Space Treaty. You barely look a day over 30. So, sir.
The question is it always relevant to do new regulation? No, it's not always relevant, it's not always necessary. It's only necessary when you really need it. So you mentioned space exploration. Today, many countries around the world, we are partners and we go out there. We have a permanently manned space station flying on our heads around the world. And we have 6 men and women flying there every day. When we decided to do space station, we defined the rules of common cooperation. It's called International Government Agreement. It's a treaty. It's been ratified by all the parties. And it's there. It was done in a matter of a few years. It's working very well. It determines what the parties do, how we behave in space, including the commander responsibility, criminal jurisdiction, a lot of things which are very sophisticated. Who owns the patents of intellectual property in space? There are a lot of things, very interesting. It's even a very good model for maybe future cooperation if we want to do more exploration, if one day we want to go to Mars, we'll do it together. We have an example. We have a treaty ratified by parliaments in US, Canada, Russia, European states, Japan. So it's very interesting, but we did it because we wanted to have a project, space station, for at least 30 years or more. But it doesn't mean we have to regulate every time. It's not because now we have a few missions to Mars, Europe, US, the UAE have a mission to Mars. We don't have to now to regulate how to go to Mars. We just do the project. And then if one day, together, we establish a manned base on Mars, maybe we need to do that. But so let's regulate only what is strictly necessary step by step.
So as he says, we got 6 people up in the ISS, thanks to Italy, 1 cappuccino machine. Nasser.
Yes, thank you. So I think very much it is very true. So in terms of space, there are, of course, the 5 treaties, and maybe there are 3 that are most popular ones. And those are giving, especially the Outer Space Treaty, is giving enough principles that, of course, most of the people in space, about 104, maybe 105 is coming soon, that are going to join this treaty. So we have about, enough of those countries that have already space programs, they follow these principles. And of course, countries through CUPUS, they keep reporting about what are they doing towards these principles in there, and every time they report toward their activities, not also to celebrate, the achievement and exchange views, but also to report that you are applying these principles in all of your programs. So this is the approach taken. But something also is interesting coming today in CUPUS, and it's the most popular approach that they do, is they do something like kind of a soft law. They do a lot of guidelines now under the CUPUS, or the Peaceful Use Committee, under the UN. So you will see guidelines related to, for example, nuclear, guidelines related to debris. Now they even have a bigger compendium, what they call the long-term sustainability guidelines, which cover other things. So they are approaching things from a softer perspective, because they know once you get into such details, it will be very difficult to make them mandatory at this stage. And being a member of that CUPUS, you come and report towards each one of these guidelines, including, of course, then later on the treaty that covers all of these principles. The second point I wanted to make is that necessity is the mother of the need. So when you look, for example, at the example of the ITU, when there is a lot of conjunctions happening, it is really burning. You cannot live with interference with radio. You had no choice but to go to standards. As a matter of fact, some of these standards are mandatory, and they are one of the volumes of the radio regulations. So that necessity is there. We don't know in the future, especially with the growing number of players, and maybe in the lower Earth orbits, with all these CubeSats and things like that, maybe space traffic management will be something that is necessary, and maybe some of these things or some of these guidelines may eventually become also mandatory things to apply. When that conjunction is there, then the necessity will have to make such guidelines to move to a level of a mandatory guideline.
Let me say, those long-term sustainability guidelines are killing me, because I bet all of my friends, no way we're getting any of those past COPUS, no way. UAE joins, Nasser gets involved in COPUS. Next thing we know, we pass a dozen of them. So now I had to buy everyone dinner. Olga.
Yeah, I just wanted to take in your question, or just my 2 cents to the answer. So I think there is one evident thing that some people just not paying attention or just forgetting sometimes. Space is internationalized area, and sovereignty of states doesn't really extend on the space or outer space. Therefore, we cannot really say that we just national legislation will be sufficient. We really have to govern it on an international level. This is extremely important, because otherwise it's going to be a kind of not mess, but yeah, it will be very chaotic. And again, elaborating further what Marcus said about Outer Space Treaty, I would when I started my presentation, I thought there was a paradigm change, and we have to adjust. We should not destroy, we have to adjust. And I believe that Autospace Treaty is really like a foundation. I can compare like with building a house here. First, you put the foundation, and then you decide what you do afterwards. So you can put like maybe construct 4 rooms, a couple of balconies, you know, put the roof on top, something like that. But foundation is really essential, so the whole system doesn't really, you know, to fix the system. And I believe Autospace Treaty, even if it's kind of maybe a little bit obsolete, maybe it's not really matching the requirements of today's space economy, it should be kept maybe as it is, but we should really look further what should be added, how it should be complemented. But this should be maintained for the time being at least.
Wonderful. So let's go back to the audience. Who wants one of these great prizes, ma'am?
Hi. Thanks, I find this all really interesting. I'd like to know a little bit more about how you would go about drafting laws that sort of flow between government and private sector, because obviously everything now is, you know, as you said, is international cooperation, inter cooperation. Everything is cooperation, cooperation, cooperation. So the lines get a little bit blurred between the government and the private sector. So is that something that you're looking at, especially with you know, new business startups that are operating outside of governmental law?
So I'll actually jump right into that one, and Nasser hit on this as well. So again, I chair the ComStack, Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee, which is a federal advisory committee with representatives from industry across the spectrum, large companies, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, as well as small new entrants, Virgin Galactic, Satellites, Space Systems, Loral, et cetera. And it was an acknowledgement by the government that they don't know enough to set those regulations, that only the private sector has the ability to provide that advice. It's not aviation, where the technology is well understood. It's also not aviation in the sense that it's the same technology. Virgin Galactic has a wildly different system than SpaceX, which is wildly different than a satellite. So you absolutely, I think, should form advisory committees that integrate your companies into the process. And if you do that, not only will you end up with a system that's better for business, but one that's better for safety as well. Nasser?
I think everything almost been said. So indeed, so when you're drafting the law, you have, as I mentioned, you have to think of all the, I mean, I'll tell you, you mentioned private sector and you mentioned government. How about academies who are interested to use space today? And, you know, they are able to come up with these CubeSats. Now they don't know what's the next step. What do I do with this? I need insurance for this? I mean, you know, I need a license for this? And really, you start adding things to them and like, you know, so you really have to think of all the categories. And even the word government has different uses. You know, there are governments that are actually commercial. You know, they're making, so today we're using, you know, the private and we're using the commercial. So you even have government that makes money out of their operation. They sell services at a national or international level. Or you have, you know, purely private, operation. Do you treat government that makes money the same way from a project that is basically free? So all these type of things you take it into account, and of course the way you do it, whenever you come up with an article or a particular matter that you would like to discuss in whatever, your law, your regulation, you think of all the different audience, and sometimes you meet one-to-one if you know that you want to take time into such discussion. And then after that, you may combine the different stakeholders that will be affected by this article. And towards the end, then you can have a session that combines everyone, and or you can just put it on a place where they can download and have a view and come back with their comments if needed. But that's basically the way. From the beginning, you think of all the different stakeholders, and you really don't, and I mentioned as one of the principles, it's not one size that fits all. So you have to think that very clearly.
Marco, I think you wanted a piece of this as well?
Just a point. As you say, public, government, and private sector, you have to think that the government might behave in different functions with respect to space activity. In many cases, government or their space agency behave and do space, technology, development, launching operations. In other cases, governments are just regulators. So they control, they regulate, and they allow an authorized license private operator to run. So governments may have dual function. Actually, all our governments around the world have at least a public space program and also allow, regulate, or favor private initiative. So I don't know of any country only has private activity. As a minimum, they have some administration or some space office that supervises. In the countries where business is more advanced in space, like US, Europe, the weight of the private sector is about 50% of what you have in space. So it's not 100%. Government is still very, very present in the public investment, in the operations, for defense, for public service. So we have to see in which kind of function and therefore which kind of regulation the government behaves.
Luca?
Yeah, very quickly. So if you are, I understand the point of institutions and like also big companies and how it works. But if you are a small business, if you are starting a new company, and quite often, I mean, if it is true that quite often the innovation comes from like young and new companies, it's also true that there should be a connection. However, it's tough, because you are under the radar. So if you are successful, you are like a bunch of people. If you are not successful, you are sacrificing only a bunch of jobs. So you don't really count. So the company needs to be proactive. What we did, it was really tough at the beginning, because when we landed in Europe at the first time, you know, Space Debris was just like an idea, a scientific paper, basically. We start getting involved like from day zero. So we joined the European Commission Space Advisory Group. We start participating to the roundtables on the subjects, and it's the only way. You have to be the one that actually, you know, like proactive. Otherwise, it's very difficult. Now that we are still a small business, but what we are doing, it's known. Now they call us, but it's something that you need to achieve on, like, you know, like working hard.
So very briefly, because I'd like to get one more question in, but Professor Hofmann and then Olga.
Thank you. Just to add to other colleagues, from my own experience, it is a common metrics. The preparation of draft legislation depends on the legislation and on the composition of the state system. But perhaps the common denominator is that usually such work starts with a deep analysis of the legal situation, of the challenges of the international law, and also of the practice of foreign countries. So it is not secret, for instance, that the provision of the draft of the Luxembourgish legislation on space resources is based on the article which is included in the US legislation, which has been already adopted. So of course we are learning one from each other. Thank you.
Yeah.
Olga.
Not talking really like about national space legislation, but referring to international space law drafting. I would say maybe because we got used to that space activities primarily as a priority of states and not of the private sector. We got used to discuss most of the issues within the UN COPUOS, so Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, or under the aegis of other international organizations. And naturally, representatives there are like governments or government representatives. And the problem was always that voices of other actors have not been really heard, or like they could serve only as observers, and it was a very like little number. So at that time, the only possibility for the private sector to be heard was through approaching the states or the officials, lobbying them, talking about what the current problems. Today, we observe more and more that there are working groups created, working groups composed from different representatives, and they work towards developing maybe let's first draft to draft some kind of basic concept, and then it's put forward for consideration of, let's say, something more global, international.
So I know space law and policy is so exciting. We could go on for hours or days like this. Unfortunately, I'm getting the hook from the program organizers. Let me apologize. I can't believe we did a space law and regulatory panel and didn't talk about export control. So if you want to come up to me afterwards and hear horrendous export control and ITAR stories, I'll be here for a little bit afterwards. In the meantime, I would like to thank the Global Space Congress, our host, the UAE Space Agency, and all of our wonderful panelists for sharing such a fascinating discussion. Let's have a round of applause for everyone.